The Grand Assembly Hall on Station Aurelius was the largest structure ever built by living hands. Its ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed inside it, drifting between the light panels that glowed like captured stars. 312 delegations sat in their designated sections, each one representing an entire species. Some had wings, some had scales, some floated in liquid tanks because they could not survive in open air. Together, they made up the Galactic Council, and together, they believed they controlled the future of every thinking creature in the galaxy. Han Doyen stood at the center of it all. He was not a tall man. He was not loud. He wore a simple dark suit instead of the decorated robes that most ambassadors preferred, and he kept his hands folded behind his back as he waited for the noise to settle. Behind him sat the rest of the human delegation, 12 men and women who had traveled 4 months through regulated star lanes to be here. They sat very still. Their faces showed nothing. Grand Arbiter Olin, the ancient reptilian leader of the council, raised one clawed hand. The hall fell silent. His voice was deep and carried easily through the translation systems built into every seat. We are here to vote on Resolution 7742, the permanent exclusion of the species known as humans, originating from the planet called Earth, from all rights, privileges, and protections of the Galactic Council. Doyen did not blink. Olin continued reading the charges. Humans were too fast. They evolved their technology at a rate that made elder species uncomfortable. 200 years ago, they had been playing with radio waves. Now they had faster-than-light ships. They fought among themselves constantly, yet somehow always came out stronger. They spread their culture like a virus. Their music, their food, their stories infected every species they touched. They were, according to the resolution, a destabilizing presence in the galactic order. When Olin finished, he turned his yellow eyes toward Doyen. The human delegation may speak. Doyen walked forward 3 steps. He looked up at the hundreds of alien faces staring down at him from their elevated seats. Some looked away. Some watched with open curiosity. A few, like Delegate Fesra of the Vireshi Collective, watched with something that looked very much like sadness. "Thank you, Grand Arbiter," Doyen said. His voice was calm and warm, the kind of voice that made people lean forward to listen. "I will not take much of your time." He told them about the medical ships Earth had sent to the Turani plague zones, free of charge. He told them about the human engineers who had rebuilt the atmospheric processors on Vireshi colony worlds after the great storms. He talked about the cultural exchange programs, the universities that had opened their doors to alien students, the trade deals that had been fair and generous even when Earth could have demanded more. "We came to this council with open hands," Doyen said. "We asked for nothing that we did not earn. We gave freely, because that is what our people believe in. We are not perfect, we know this, but we have been good neighbors." He paused and looked directly at Olin. "That is all I have to say." He stepped back. The hall was quiet for a moment, and then the voting began. Each delegation pressed their decision into the system. The numbers climbed on the massive display above the arbiter's seat. For exclusion, against exclusion. The gap was never close. 281 in favor, 31 against. Earth was out. Olin announced the result with the same flat tone he used for everything. Effective immediately. Humanity is excluded from the Galactic Council. All trade agreements are void. All Starlane access permits are revoked. All diplomatic protections are withdrawn. The hall waited. Every species there had seen exclusion votes before, though they were rare. Usually the excluded species begged. Sometimes they threatened. Once a delegation had broken down and wept in front of the entire assembly. The council expected something dramatic from the humans. They were, after all, known for being emotional creatures. Doyen turned to face his delegation. He gave them a small nod. All 12 of them stood up at the same time, as if they had practiced it. They gathered their things quietly. One of them closed a notebook. Another tucked a tablet under her arm. They moved without rushing. Then Doyen turned back to the assembly. He looked at Olin. He looked at the delegations. And he smiled. It was not an angry smile. It was not a sad smile. It was the kind of smile a person gives when they know something that nobody else in the room has figured out yet. "We thank the council for its honesty," Doyen said. "We wish you all well. Truly." He bowed once, a shallow and respectful bow, and then he turned and walked toward the exit. His delegation followed in a single line. Their footsteps echoed in the enormous hall. Nobody spoke. Nobody shouted. Nobody looked back. The doors closed behind them. For a long moment, the assembly hall was completely silent. Then the murmuring began. Delegations turned to each other with confusion on their faces. That was it? No anger? No demands? No warnings? The humans had simply accepted the result and left? Delegate Fesra sat frozen in her seat. Her hands were trembling. She had studied humans longer than anyone on the council. She had lived among them for 6 years. She had learned their history, read their literature, watched their wars, and their recoveries. And she knew something that the rest of the council did not understand. Humans did not go quiet because they were defeated. Humans went quiet when they were done talking. And humans were only done talking when they had already decided what they were going to do next. She looked at the closed doors and felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Outside the assembly hall, Doyen walked through the long corridor toward the shuttle bay. His delegation was behind him, still silent. When they reached the shuttle, he stopped at the door and pulled out a secure communicator. He entered a code that only 4 people in all of human space knew about. Yunari answered on the second pulse. Her voice was steady, as always. "How did it go?" she asked, though she already knew. Doyen looked back at Station Aralis through the viewport. The massive structure glowed against the darkness of space, like a jewel that believed it was the center of everything. "Green light," he said. "Execute Protocol Horizon." He stepped into the shuttle. The doors sealed shut, and the last human ship at Station Aralis undocked and slipped quietly into the black. The galaxy expected humanity to fall apart within 6 months. That was the number the Council's economic analysts had calculated. 6 months without access to the regulated star lanes. 6 months without alien trade partners. 6 months without the protection that came with Council membership. After 6 months, the analysts said, Earth would come crawling back, humbled and desperate, ready to accept whatever reduced terms the Council offered. 6 months passed, then 12, then 18. Earth said nothing. The human embassies on every Council world had closed within a week of the vote. The staff had packed their things, smiled politely at their alien colleagues, and left on the next available transport. Human merchant ships, which had once been a common sight in every major port, disappeared from the trade routes. Human communication channels, which had broadcast music and news and entertainment across dozens of frequencies, went dark. It was as if someone had reached into the galaxy and pulled out every trace of humanity like thread from a cloth. At first, the Council treated it as a victory. Olin gave a speech about stability and the natural order of things. Several delegations held celebrations. The Kethari Dominion, a militaristic species that had always hated humanity's unpredictable nature, was especially pleased. Warlord Dren publicly declared that the galaxy was finally rid of its most annoying pest. But Yunari was counting on exactly this reaction. She sat in a windowless room beneath the mountains of Gangwon, surrounded by screens that showed data from every corner of human space. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night since the vote, and she did not plan to start. Protocol Horizon was the most complex operation in human history, and she was the one holding all the pieces together. The plan was simple in concept and staggering in execution. For the past 40 years, ever since humanity had first joined the Council and seen how the elder species looked at them with fear and suspicion, a small group within Earth's government had been quietly preparing for the possibility of exclusion. They had mapped unclaimed regions of space that the Council had never bothered to explore. They had stockpiled resources, and most importantly, they had held back their best technology. The Council believed that human science was impressive, but manageable. They were wrong. Shin Hyon, the head of Earth's Science and Innovation Bureau, had spent her entire career managing the gap between what humanity could do and what humanity showed the galaxy. Zero-point energy extraction, which could pull limitless power from the fabric of space itself, had been perfected 12 years ago. Self-replicating construction swarms, tiny machines that could build anything from a coffee cup to a space station if given raw materials, had been tested and refined in secret facilities on the dark side of Earth's moon. And a new generation of faster-than-light drives, ones that did not need the Council's regulated star lanes, had been sitting in storage for almost a decade. Heian had argued for years that revealing these technologies would only make the Council more afraid. She had been right. And now, with humanity free of Council restrictions, she finally had permission to use them. The construction swarms went out first. Hundreds of tiny ships, each one carrying billions of microscopic machines, launched from hidden bases and scattered into the unclaimed territories. Within weeks, they were eating asteroids and building stations, shipyards, habitats, farms. Entire cities appeared in the darkness between stars, growing like crystals in a solution. Captain Kwon Tae-ho, commanding the stealth warship ESS Baekdu, led the ghost fleet that protected these new settlements. His ships ran on the new drives and carried the new weapons, and they moved through space without leaving any trace that Council sensors could detect. Back in Council space, Bae Sorin was doing the most dangerous work of all. She had been an intelligence operative on Station Aralis for 3 years before the vote, living under a false identity as a minor trade consultant from a neutral species. When the other humans left, she stayed behind. Her job was to watch, listen, and report. And what she reported was fascinating. The cracks started small. The Tarani, a species that relied heavily on human-manufactured medicine, began rationing their supplies within 4 months. The drugs were not difficult to make, but no other species produced them as cheaply or as effectively as humans did. The Vareshi Collective, which had imported massive quantities of human agricultural technology, watched their crop yields drop as the equipment broke down and no replacement parts arrived. Even species that had voted enthusiastically for exclusion began to feel the absence. Human entertainment, their films, their music, their games, had been more popular than anyone wanted to admit. Now it was gone, and nothing had filled the gap. Black markets appeared almost immediately. Human goods became luxury items. A bottle of human coffee, which had once been an inexpensive curiosity, now sold for the equivalent of a month's wages on some stations. Counterfeit human technology flooded the markets, most of it poor quality and sometimes dangerous. Several species quietly sent messages into the void, trying to reach Earth through unofficial channels. They received no response. Soren watched all of this from her small apartment on Station Aralis. She sent compressed data bursts to Earth every 3 days, disguised as routine commercial signals. She documented the growing unease, the whispered conversations between delegates, the rising tension between the species that still supported the exclusion and those that were beginning to regret it. She also watched the Cathari Dominion. Warlord Dren had been growing bolder. His fleet had increased patrols along the borders of weaker species. His diplomats had become more aggressive in trade negotiations. Without humanity's unpredictable military presence to worry about, Dren seemed to be testing how far he could push. Soren flagged this in every report. She knew where it was heading. Nari knew too. On Earth, the transformation was visible from orbit. New shipyards circled the planet like rings. The moon had become a factory. Mars, which had been a slow colonization project for decades, was now a fully operational industrial world. Humanity was not suffering. Humanity was building. 18 months after the vote, Grand Arbiter Olin received an intelligence report that made his blood run cold. Cathari border sensors had detected massive energy signatures in the unclaimed rim, the empty regions beyond council space that no species had ever found worth exploring. Scout ships were sent to investigate. They found nothing. The energy signatures had vanished, but in the places where they had been, the scouts found trace particles that matched no known technology. And buried in the background radiation, so faint that the sensors almost missed it, there was something else. A human radio signal. An old song, broadcast on a frequency that nobody used anymore, drifting through the emptiness like a ghost. Olin stared at the report for a long time. Then he called an emergency session of the Council's Security Committee. For the first time since the vote, he did not look confident. Somewhere in the unclaimed dark, aboard the bridge of the ESS Baekdu, Captain Kwan Taeho leaned back in his chair and watched the construction swarms finish another shipyard. 212 warships, 47 supply stations, 16 colony worlds, and they were still growing. He opened a channel to Nari. "We are ahead of schedule," he said. "Good," she replied, "because I do not think we have as much time as we hoped." 2 years after the vote, the Vareshi homeworld of Tisana started dying. It began with a fungal infection in the grain fields of the southern continent. The Vareshi had seen this kind of infection before. It was manageable, treatable, and usually contained within a single growing season. But the treatment required a specific enzyme compound that had, for the last 30 years, been manufactured and supplied by human agricultural companies. The compound was cheap, effective, and delivered on a regular schedule. The Vareshi had never bothered to develop their own version because there had never been a reason to. Now there was a reason, and it was too late. The infection spread across 3 continents in 4 months. Crop yields dropped by 60%. Food rationing began on a world that had not known hunger in living memory. Children went to bed with empty stomachs, and their parents sat in dark kitchens and wondered how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Delegate Fesra stood before the council assembly and begged for help. Not from humanity. She knew better than to ask the council to reach out to the species it had just expelled. She begged the other member species to share their agricultural knowledge, to send supplies, to do something. But the council's systems were not built for rapid response. Requests had to go through committees. Committees had to consult with subcommittees. Resources had to be allocated according to a priority system that had not been updated in 80 years. By the time the first shipment of alien grain arrived on Tisana, another continent had lost its harvest. Fesro returned to her quarters and sat alone in the dark. She thought about the human agricultural teams that had once worked on Vareshi colony worlds. They had been young, loud, and messy. They had played music while they worked, and taught Vareshi children human card games during breaks. They had fixed problems in days that Vareshi engineers said would take months. And they had done it all for a price so low that it was practically a gift. She missed them terribly. But the Vareshi famine was not the only crisis. Across council space, the absence of humanity was tearing holes in the fabric of galactic civilization. The Tyranni had run out of their human-made medications entirely. A respiratory disease that had been under control for a decade was spreading again. The Thanari, a small aquatic species, had lost access to the human-designed water purification systems that kept their orbital habitats livable. 2 habitats had already been evacuated. And then there was the Cathari Dominion. Warlord Dren had been patient for 2 years. Patient by Cathari standards, at least. He had watched the council weaken. He had watched the smaller species struggle. And he had decided that the time was right to take what he wanted. The Cathari Dominion began moving warships to the borders of 3 smaller species. The official explanation was military exercises. Nobody believed it. When a Cathari battle group entered the orbital space of a Fenari trade station and demanded docking rights, the Fenari had no choice but to agree. They had no military. They had relied on the Council's mutual defense agreements, which were, in practice, nothing more than words on a document. On Earth, Nari watched all of this from her underground command center. Every report from Base Soren, every intercepted communication, every piece of data from the Ghost Fleet sensor network, all of it flowed through her screens. She organized it, analyzed it, and presented it to Ambassador Han Do-yoon in clear, precise briefings. Do-yoon listened to each briefing without expression. He had aged in the 2 years since the vote. The gray in his hair had spread, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there before. He did not regret leaving the council. But he had not expected the other species to suffer this much, and the weight of that suffering sat on his shoulders, even though it was not his fault. The Cathari are going to move on the Vareshi, Nari said during one briefing. She pulled up a map showing fleet positions. Tasana is weakened by the famine. Their military is small. Dren sees an opportunity. And the council? Do-yoon asked. Debating. They will still be debating when the Cathari ships enter Vareshi space. Shin Haeyeon was also in the room, sitting in her usual corner with a tablet in her hands. We are not ready to show everything, she said carefully. If we intervene now, the council will see what we have built. We lose the advantage of surprise. If we do not intervene, the Vareshi lose their freedom, Do-yoon replied. That is not our responsibility anymore. They voted to exclude us, 281 to 31. The Vareshi were part of that 31, but the rest were not. The room was quiet. It was the question that had been hanging over every decision since Protocol Horizon began. How far did humanity's obligation go? They had been thrown out. They owed the galaxy nothing. Every strategic calculation said the same thing. Stay hidden, keep building, reveal nothing until humanity was so powerful that no force in the galaxy could threaten them again. But Park Juno was also in the room. He was the youngest person at the table, a logistics officer who had been assigned to Nari's staff 6 months ago. He was not supposed to speak in these briefings, but he stood up anyway, and when he spoke, his voice was shaking. I lived on Tasana for a year, he said. Exchange program, when I was in the academy. I stayed with a Vareshi family. They taught me how to cook their food. Their daughter taught me how to play a board game with stones. He paused. She would be 12 now, 12 years old, and she is going hungry because we left. We did not leave, Haeyeon said. We were thrown out. It doesn't matter, Juno said. She is 12, and she is hungry, and a Cathari warship is coming to her planet. We can help. We should help. Not because of politics, because she is a child, and she needs help. The room was silent again. Nari looked at Do-yoon. Haeyeon looked at her tablet. Juno stood with his hands clenched at his sides, knowing he had probably ended his career by speaking out of turn. Do-yoon stared at the star map for a very long time. He looked at the Vareshi colonies, small green dots surrounded by the red markers of Cathari fleet movements. He thought about the vote. He thought about the smile he had given the council as he walked out. He thought about what kind of species humanity wanted to be. Then he looked at Nari. We do not do this for the council, he said. We do this because it is who we are. Nari nodded once. She had already prepared the orders. She had known what Doyun would decide before he decided it, because she had known him for 20 years, and she knew that he would always choose the harder right over the easier wrong. She opened a secure channel to the Ghost Fleet. "Captain Quan," she said, "wake up the Ghost Fleet. You are going to Tessara." On the bridge of the Bakdu, somewhere in the darkness between stars, Teho heard the order and felt something settle in his chest. He had been waiting for this. His crew had been waiting for this. They had trained for 2 years, built an entire military force from nothing, and kept it hidden from every sensor in the galaxy. They were ready. He stood up from his chair and looked at his bridge crew. "Set course for the Vareshi border," he said, "and put on some music. It is time to let the galaxy know we are still here." Far away, on Station Auralis, Bay Soren intercepted a Cathari military transmission. A dreadnought fleet of 40 warships had been deployed toward Tessara. They expected to arrive in 9 days. They expected no resistance. Soren encrypted the data and sent it to Earth. Then she leaned back in her chair, and for the first time in 2 years, allowed herself a small smile. The Cathari had no idea what was coming. The Cathari dreadnought fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Tessera system with the confidence of a predator arriving at a wounded animal. 40 warships, each one built for destruction, each one carrying enough firepower to reduce a city to glass. Warlord Dren was not with them in person, but his voice came through the fleet's command channel from his flagship 3 systems away, giving orders with the casual tone of someone who had already decided how this would end. "Secure orbit around the colony. Disable their communication satellites first. I want them isolated before they can call for help." The fleet commander, a scarred Cathari officer named Voss, acknowledged the order and began deploying his ships into an attack formation. The Vireshi colony below had a population of 800,000. They had 6 patrol ships, none of them armed with anything that could scratch a Cathari hull. This was not going to be a battle. It was going to be a demonstration. Then the sensors screamed. 48 ships appeared out of nothing. Not out of faster-than-light travel, which always left a detectable energy trail. Not from behind a moon or asteroid, which the Cathari had already scanned. They simply appeared, as if they had been there the entire time, invisible and waiting. The ships were sleek, dark, and completely unlike anything in the Council's registry. They ran no identification signals. They broadcast no warnings. They just sat there, arranged in a perfect crescent formation between the Cathari fleet and the planet below. Commander Voss stared at his tactical display. "What am I looking at?" he asked. His sensor officer's voice was unsteady. "Unknown vessel configuration. No match in any database. Energy readings are... I have never seen readings like these, Commander." Voss opened a communication channel. "Unidentified fleet. You are interfering with a lawful military operation of the Cathari Dominion. Identify yourselves and withdraw, or you will be fired upon." The response came on an open channel, broadcast so that every ship in the system could hear it. The voice was calm, almost friendly, and it spoke in perfect Cathari. "Captain Quan Teho of the Earthship Baekdu. You are in orbit over a civilian colony. I am going to ask you once, politely, to leave." The Cathari bridge was silent for 3 seconds. Then Voss laughed. "Humans? There are no humans in Council space. You were excluded. You have no rights here." "That is correct," Teho replied. "We have no rights here. We also have no rules here. Think about what that means, Commander, and then decide if you still want to do this." Voss cut the channel and turned to his weapons officer. "Target the lead human ship. Full barrage." The Cathari dreadnought fired everything it had. Plasma torpedoes, kinetic rounds, energy beams, a wall of destruction that should have turned any ship into scattered metal. The shots crossed the distance in seconds and hit the Baekdu directly. The Baekdu did not move. The weapon struck a shimmering barrier that absorbed every impact like water absorbing a thrown stone. The energy simply vanished. When the barrage ended, the human ship was exactly where it had been, without a single mark on its hull. Tejo opened the channel again. "Are you finished?" What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. The human fleet moved, but it did not move the way ships were supposed to move. The ships micro-jumped, tiny faster-than-light hops of only a few kilometers, appearing and disappearing across the battlefield like flickers of shadow. One moment, a human ship was in front of a Cathari dreadnought. The next moment, it was behind it. The next moment, it was beside it. And every time a human ship appeared next to a Cathari vessel, something happened to that vessel. Their weapons went offline. Their engines stuttered. Their shields collapsed. It was not weapons fire in any traditional sense. It was electronic warfare so advanced that it made the Cathari system simply stop working. Targeting computers went blind. Navigation systems fed false data. Communication arrays broadcast static. In 11 minutes, the entire Cathari fleet was disabled. 40 warships drifted in orbit, powerless and silent, their crews alive and unharmed, but completely unable to fight. Not a single Cathari soldier had been killed. Not a single hull had been breached. The humans had won without destroying anything. Commander Voss sat in his darkened bridge, surrounded by dead screens, and understood, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be helpless. Tejo's voice came through on the emergency backup channel, the only system the humans had left functioning. "Commander, your life support is untouched. Your escape pods are operational. You can wait for rescue, or you can use the pods. Either way, you are done here." On Station Aralis, the battle footage arrived within hours. Bae Soren had made sure of that. She had leaked it through 6 different channels, making it impossible to suppress or censor. Every delegation in the council watched the recording. They watched the Cathari fire everything they had at a human ship that did not even bother to dodge. They watched the human fleet dance through space like ghosts. They watched 40 warships go dark without a single explosion. The assembly hall erupted into chaos. Grand Arbiter Olin demanded emergency sessions. He called the human action a violation of council sovereignty. He used words like illegal and unauthorized act of war. He wanted sanctions. He wanted a formal condemnation. He wanted someone, anyone, to agree with him that this was unacceptable. Delegate Fesra stood up. She was small, even by Vireshi standards, and she had never been known as a powerful speaker. But when she spoke, the hall went quiet, because there were tears running down her face and her voice was steady and strong. "My people are starving," she said. "A Cathari fleet came to enslave us. The council debated while our children went hungry. And the species you threw away, the species you told to leave, they came back. They came back, and they saved us. And they did not kill a single one of our enemies to do it." She paused and looked directly at Olin. "You call this illegal? I call this the first decent thing that has happened in this galaxy since you decided to throw away the only species that ever cared about anyone other than themselves." The hall was completely still. Fesra sat down. Nobody argued with her. On the surface of Tessara, Park Juno stepped off a transport shuttle and into warm alien sunlight. He had been assigned to the humanitarian team, and he carried a case of medical supplies in each hand. Behind him, 200 human aid workers were unloading food, medicine, water purifiers, and agricultural equipment. The new equipment, the kind that Shin Hyon's bureau had built, better than anything the galaxy had ever seen. A Vireshi family was standing near the landing zone, watching the humans arrive. A young girl, maybe 12 years old, stood in front of her parents with wide eyes. She was thin in a way that made Juno's chest ache. He walked over and knelt down so that he was at her eye level. He did not speak Vireshi well, but he knew a few words. He held out a ration pack and smiled. "Hungry?" he asked in her language. She took the pack carefully, as if she could not believe it was real. Then she looked up at him and said something that his translator rendered as, "Are you going to leave again?" Juno looked at the sky where human ships hung like silver seeds against the blue. He thought about the vote, about the council, about all the politics and strategy that had brought him to this moment. And then he looked back at the girl. "No," he said, "we are not going anywhere." Back in orbit, Tejo received a message from Warlord Dren. It was short, only 2 sentences. "Withdraw now, or face the full power of the Cathari Dominion." Tejo showed the message to his bridge crew. They read it and looked at each other. His weapons officer raised an eyebrow. His navigator smiled. His communications officer started to laugh. Tejo forwarded the message to Earth. Shin Haiyan read it first. She passed it to Doyun and Nari. The 3 of them stood around a table covered in star charts and fleet reports. And Haiyan smiled the kind of smile that made people who did not know her very nervous. "Should I tell him about the other 200 ships?" she said. "Or would that spoil the surprise?" Warlord Dren mobilized everything. 600 warships, pulled from every corner of Cathari territory, dreadnoughts, carriers, gunships, and the flagship Iron Spine, the largest warship in Council space. It was a fleet designed to terrify, and it had worked against every species that had ever seen it. Dren broadcast his advance on open channels so the entire galaxy could watch. He wanted everyone to see what happened to those who humiliated the Cathari Dominion. The fleet arrived at the Tessara sector in a formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers of space. 600 warships against the 48 human ships that had embarrassed Commander Voss. The numbers were overwhelming. The outcome, Dren believed, was certain. Captain Quan Tejo watched the Cathari armada drop out of faster-than-light travel and felt nothing but a calm, steady patience. They all had. "Open a channel to the Cathari flagship," he said. Dren's face appeared on screen. He was enormous, even by Cathari standards, with a jaw lined with ceremonial scars and eyes the color of burnt metal. He looked at Tejo the way a predator looks at something small. "You should have run, human," Dren said. "Now you will die here, far from your little planet, and nobody will remember your name." Tejo nodded politely, as if Dren had made an interesting point about the weather. "Warlord, before you give any orders, I would like to share something with you. I am sending a tactical feed to your bridge. I suggest you look at it." Dren's tactical officer received the feed and threw it onto the main display. For 3 seconds, nobody on the Cathari bridge spoke. The feed showed the space around the Cathari fleet. Every ship was tagged with a targeting marker. Every shield frequency had been mapped. Every weapon system, every engine output, every structural weakness, all of it was catalogued and displayed in clean, precise detail. The humans knew exactly what the Cathari had, down to the last bolt. And then the feed expanded, and the real picture appeared. 214 human warships surrounded the Cathari fleet in a sphere that had no gaps. They had been there before the Cathari arrived, waiting in stealth, invisible to every sensor the Dominion possessed. 12 mobile starbases hung at the edges of the formation, each one bristling with weapons that the Cathari had no name for. And beyond that, stretching across the unclaimed territories, the feed showed a network of defense stations, communication relays, and shipyards that connected 16 colony worlds in a web of infrastructure that should not have been possible to build in 2 years. Humanity had not just survived its exclusion. It had become something entirely new. Dren stared at the display. His officers stared at the display. The bridge was absolutely silent, except for the hum of the engines and the slow beeping of the targeting alarms that were now sounding on every console. Tejo spoke again. His voice was quiet and carried no threat, which made it more frightening than any shout. "You can still go home, warlord. Every one of your people can go home alive. That is what I am offering you. Take it." The silence lasted almost a full minute. Dren's claws dug into the arms of his command chair. His pride screamed at him to attack, to go down fighting, to show the galaxy that the Cathari were not afraid. But Dren had not become warlord by being stupid. He could read tactical data. He knew what those numbers meant. He gave the order to withdraw. 600 Cathari warships turned and left, one by one, their engines burning blue against the black. Not a single shot was fired. The greatest military force in Council space retreated from a species that had been expelled from galactic civilization, and the entire galaxy watched it happen in real time. On Station Aurelus, the Council was in crisis. Delegates shouted over each other. Committees collapsed. Alliances that had held for centuries crumbled in a single afternoon. Grand Arbiter Olin sat in his elevated seat and watched his carefully maintained order fall apart around him. He had one card left to play. He sent a formal message to Earth, offering humanity conditional readmission to the Galactic Council. The conditions were generous, he thought. Reduced voting rights for the first 50 years, technology sharing requirements, military limitations. It was more than any excluded species had ever been offered. 3 days later, Ambassador Han Doyun walked into the Grand Assembly Hall on Station Aurelus. He looked exactly as he had 2 years ago. The same dark suit, the same calm expression, the same quiet way of standing that made every alien in the room pay attention. Behind him walked Yoon Nari, Shin Haeyeon, Park Juno, and Bae Sorin, who had finally stepped out of the shadows and stood with her people openly for the first time in 3 years. The hall was packed. Every delegation was present. The gallery above was full of observers, journalists, and citizens from dozens of species who had come to witness what everyone knew was a historic moment. Olin presented the offer formally. He read the terms in his deep, ancient voice, and when he finished, he looked at Doyon with an expression that was supposed to be generous, but came across as a man offering a glass of water to someone standing next to an ocean. Doyon thanked the Grand Arbiter for the offer. Then he politely declined. The hall erupted in confused murmuring. Humanity did not want to rejoin the Council? No, Doyon said, and his voice carried through the hall with the same warmth it had always carried. We do not want to rejoin under the old terms. The old terms created a system where 300 species could vote to abandon one, where the strong could threaten the weak, and where no one was required to help anyone. That system failed. Not just for us, for everyone. He paused and looked around the hall. He looked at the small delegations, the ones from species that had no military, no economic power, no voice, the ones that the Council had always ignored. We are offering something different, he said, a new accord, not between a council and its members, but between equals. Open borders for any species that chooses to join. Shared technology with no suppression clauses. A mutual defense pact based on choice, not obligation. And a seat for every species, not based on how old they are or how powerful they are, but simply because they exist and they matter. He produced a document, a real physical document, printed on paper, because humans understood the power of symbols, and placed it on the central podium. Anyone who wants to sign, can sign, Doyon said. There are no conditions, there are no restrictions, there is only a promise that we will help each other, protect each other, and never leave each other behind. Delegate Fesra was the first to stand. She walked down from her section with tears in her eyes, as she had done once before. But this time they were not tears of grief. She picked up the pen and signed the document with her species-flowing script. The Vareshi representative beside her signed next, then the Tirani, then the Fenari, then species after species, small and large, rising from their seats and walking down to the podium. The line stretched across the hall. Olin watched. He did not sign. He sat in his elevated seat and watched the power he had held for centuries walk away from him, one signature at a time. Up in the gallery, Park Juno stood between two Vireshi friends he had made during his exchange year. One of them was the older brother of the girl he had given food to on Tessara. They stood shoulder to shoulder, and when the 30th species signed the accord, the brother turned to Juno and said something that the translator rendered as, "Your people are strange." Juno smiled. "I know. You were thrown out, you were hurt, and you came back to help the ones who hurt you. Why?" Juno thought about it. He thought about Doyun's calm smile in the assembly hall. He thought about Nari working through the night in her underground room. He thought about Teho offering mercy to an enemy that would not have shown the same. He thought about Heian building miracles in secret. He thought about Soren spending 3 years alone in enemy territory. "Because that is what humans do," he said. "We get knocked down and we get back up, and we bring everyone else with us." Bay Soren stood near the back of the hall, watching the signatures pile up. She had spent 3 years hiding, 3 years pretending to be someone else. Now she wore her real name on her chest and stood in the light, and it felt like breathing after a long time underwater. Shin Hyon was already in a side room with alien scientists from 6 different species, sketching diagrams on a shared screen and talking faster than the translators could keep up. The alien scientists kept making sounds that Hyon's assistant told her meant amazement. Hyon just kept talking. Captain Quan Teho was not at Station Oralis. He was on the bridge of the Baekdu, in orbit above Tessara, watching the first joint patrol, human and Vireshi ships flying side by side, pass below him. He did not need to be at the signing. He had done his part. He preferred the quiet. And in the assembly hall, when the last signature was placed and the crowd began to cheer, Doyun stepped away from the noise. He walked to a viewport at the edge of the hall and stood there alone, looking out at the stars. Yoon Nari found him there, as she always did. 47 species signed, she said. More are expected tomorrow. Doyun nodded. He watched a human cruiser pass by the station, its running lights blinking against the darkness. "Do you think they will ever understand us?" Nari asked. Doyun considered this. He thought about the vote, about the silence, about the war that never happened, about the accord that had been signed today. He thought about 14 billion people on a small blue planet who had been told they did not belong, and who had responded by building a future big enough for everyone. But they do not have to understand us. They just have to know one thing. What is that? He watched the joint patrol disappear around the curve of the planet, human and alien ships flying together into the light of a foreign sun. We do not leave people behind. Nari stood beside him and said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. Outside the viewport, the galaxy stretched on forever, full of stars and silence and the promise of something better. And somewhere in all that darkness, a species that had been told to leave had built a door big enough for everyone to walk through. All you had to do was knock.